Hi everyone, and welcome to video number 17 on King Henry VIII and his chief ministers. Now, this video, ladies and gentlemen, is all about Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour. If you recall, his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, Henry was married to her for 24 years. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, Henry was married to her for 3 years. His third wife, Jane Seymour, Henry was only married to her for about 1 year. But, although it was only a short time, she remains a very important queen in our story about Henry VIII. Why is that? Well, hopefully this video will have a look and I'll be able to explain the significance of the marriage to Jane Seymour. First of all, Henry married Jane 30th of May 1536. In fact, he asked her to marry him just 1 day after Anne Boleyn had been executed. Wow, that's fairly quick moving. Out with the old, in with the new. Henry VIII was not hanging around, ladies and gentlemen. Some say that Cromwell had been involved in the background of trying to arrange the marriage. And in fact, the previous summer of 1535, Henry, going round the country, stayed at a place called Wolf Hall. There it is, the very famous book by Hilary Mantel. And Wolf Hall, of course, is where the Seymour family lived. So maybe Cromwell has arranged for Henry to stay at Wolf Hall to try and prompt him to get interested in Jane Seymour. Anyway, after the death of Anne Boleyn, Henry more than ever desperately needed an heir. Hopefully, of course, from his perspective, he was desperate for her son. But why all of a sudden? Why the urgent rush? Well, let's think about it for a while. His previous 2 marriages, first to Catherine of Aragon, secondly to Anne Boleyn, they had been declared to be not lawful, not legal. Therefore, the 2 daughters from the marriages, Mary and Elizabeth, were in fact illegitimate in law. So they probably would not be able to succeed and take over from Henry VIII. He's got a problem. He doesn't want to leave the succession hanging in the air because it's weakening the Tudor dynasty. It's weakening his power. Potential enemies might try to pounce. If you remember, he did have a son from one of his mistresses, a son called Henry Fitzroy. Now, because of the changes in the law that Cromwell had brought in, giving more power to the king, some people were thinking that Henry was about to say, well, I'm going to make Henry Fitzroy legitimate and he can take over from me. Some people think he may well have had the power to do that. But unfortunately, poor old Henry VIII, he's not having much luck at all. This son, Henry Fitzroy, died in July 1536, aged only 17. So now Henry is stuck. He's got no son at all, legitimate or illegitimate. He's got 2 illegitimate daughters. He's in a weaker position. So now we see the cause, the rush to try and marry Jane Seymour very, very quickly. Well, who was this Jane Seymour? What was she like? Well, she'd been a lady in waiting, sort of a helper at Queen Anne Boleyn's court. She was considered to be quite plain, I suppose, compared to Anne Boleyn, who was very flirtatious, if you remember. Jane was considered to be gentle, she was quite popular, she was nowhere near as opinionated as Anne was. She rarely tried to intervene or interfere in politics. Maybe Henry, after the sort of pushiness of Anne Boleyn, would quite welcome this. very occasionally she did try to sort of suggest things to Henry VIII. One of them was to do with the punishment of the leaders of the Pilgrimage of Grace. We'll look at this in a later video. But Henry very quickly and very firmly told Jane Seymour to keep your nose out, which she did. She obeyed Henry. So maybe Henry was attracted by this. What about our old friend Cromwell, working away in the background? Remember, he seems to have been involved in setting up the marriage. Once the marriage had taken place, Cromwell sees a chance and he arranges for the wedding, the marriage of his own son, Gregory Cromwell, to Jane's sister, Elizabeth. So Cromwell's son has married the sister of Henry VIII's third wife. Cromwell, ladies and gentlemen, is hugely chuffed by this. Why would that be? Have you got any ideas? Well, it's an increase in his power, his reputation, his influence, certainly. But most importantly, this meant that Cromwell was now related by marriage to King Henry VIII. It was a great move for Cromwell because he saw that it would ensure the future safety of himself and his family. Cromwell's enemies, of whom there were some, Cromwell's enemies could not attack him anymore because it could be viewed as an indirect attack on the king himself because Cromwell is related. So Cromwell is chuffed with this marriage. He is now related and strengthened. Great news for Cromwell. Let's go back to Jane. What's her main job? Well, Queen of England, she had one job: produce an heir. And hopefully, of course, produce a son. That was her task as far as Henry was concerned. So we get to the fateful day, 12th of October 1537. Jane is pregnant. Jane gives birth to you've named it, to a son. Hooray! Da, 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 da. At last, says King Henry VIII. Thank goodness I have got a legitimate male heir called Edward. Henry's delighted. He can turn round now to his doubters and say, aha, my first two marriages didn't work because God hadn't approved of them. But God approves of this marriage because he's blessed it with a son. It's sort of giving vindication to all that Henry had done. And of course, the succession was secured. Henry's delighted. The family are delighted. Cromwell is delighted. The country, everyone is rejoicing. Great news. Nothing could go wrong. Or could it? There's always a but in history, ladies and gentlemen. And this is it. In Tudor England, giving birth was a very, very dangerous event. Jane's labour had been long and difficult. And sadly, within 2 weeks of Henry's son being born, Jane Seymour died. We think probably from an infection which we call puerperal fever. This was a disaster. A disaster for whom? Well, number one, of course, King Henry himself, hugely upset. This was the wife who had finally produced a son. She was young, so Henry was thinking, no worries, we can have even more sons. I can totally secure the succession of the Tudors. In case anything happened to the first son, I will have other sons. He was feeling very, very optimistic, and then his wife died. He seems to have genuinely loved this wife. Just as a sort of point of this, when Henry himself died, he was buried next to Jane Seymour, of all the wives. Another factor about his love for Jane Seymour, a sign of how much he was upset. Previously, after the marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he married Anne Boleyn very quickly. After the death of Anne Boleyn, he married Jane Seymour very quickly. After the death of Jane Seymour, he waited more than 2 years to remarry, even though pressure was put on him to marry for the good of the country. He does seem to have mourned and respected and grieved the death of Jane Seymour. Maybe if Jane had survived, old history teachers like me would have been talking about Henry VIII and his 3 wives, as opposed to what eventually happened, Henry VIII and his 6 wives. So it was a disaster for Henry, on a personal level and also on the succession level. It was also a disaster, ladies and gentlemen, for Cromwell. Go back to that day, 12th of October 1537, when Edward was born. Now, I've got no idea what the weather was like, but I bet King Henry thought it was a sunny day. Sunny day, sun. Sorry, terrible joke. I apologise for that. But for Cromwell, it was a disaster. Why? Well, he no longer had a family connection to Henry. His son was married to Jane's sister, Elizabeth, but Jane was no longer queen. So Cromwell's future was not as secure as it had been. It strengthened his potential enemies. I suppose Cromwell could see more trouble and complications ahead. See more. I must stop these terrible puns. I apologise. Well, for Cromwell, he knew problems were coming. The first thing he would have to do is try to arrange yet another marriage, a 4th marriage, and we'll look at that in a later video. But equally, he knew he was weakened. So for Cromwell, the sad death of Jane Seymour was also a personal disaster. So as we come to the end of the video, the final part of the Jane Seymour story. She had 2 brothers, and as we'll see, just like the Boleyn family, when Anne Boleyn became queen, the Boleyn family rose in influence and power and wealth. Similarly with Jane Seymour, when Jane became queen, her 2 brothers rose in power, influence and wealth. The first one, Edward Seymour. He'd been a soldier for Henry fighting in the French wars. As Jane is linked with Henry, he gets promoted. He becomes a member of the nobility, the Earl of Hertford. He becomes a member of the Royal Council, an advisor to Henry. Yes, he suffered a slight loss of influence after the death of his sister, Jane Seymour. But when Henry died and Edward took over at quite a young age, it was Edward Seymour who acted as the Lord Protector for the young King Edward. So that just shows how much power he had. Later, of course, he upset people, and typically in Tudor England, he ended up being executed. What about the other brother, Thomas Seymour? Well, he also benefited. Increase in land, in titles, he was knighted. The Duke of Norfolk, who was one of the top nobles in the country, was eager for his own daughter to marry Thomas Seymour. That shows the influence of the Seymour family. Now, that marriage never went ahead, but it still shows how influential the Seymours were. When Henry himself died, Thomas Seymour married Henry's surviving widow, Catherine Parr. So that shows how powerful the Seymours were. Typically, just like his brother, Edward, Thomas Seymour eventually executed. It was the way of Tudor England, ladies and gentlemen. So as we've seen, The Jane Seymour story was very significant because finally Henry has his male heir, Edward. The Tudor succession has been secured. For Cromwell, it's been a bit of a roller coaster. Way, I'm related to Henry by marriage. Oh no, I'm not. What does the future hold for Cromwell? Well, if you remember this from a previous video, these were the jobs that Cromwell had to do. Well, we've had a look at how he arranged the marriage of Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour. But there were other things for him to do. Increase Henry's power, defending England, establishing church power, stop opposition to Henry. And it's these other tasks, these other roles for Cromwell as Chief Minister that we'll have a look at in the next videos. As ever, I hope it's been useful. All the best, and I'll see you soon. Bye now.